Hello, and welcome to the last session of the conference today. My name is Natalia Defiel, and I'm going to be your moderator for the last session. I'm a student here at the university, a grad student, my 6th year. So the first presenter for this session, his name is Patrick McNamara. He's an associate professor at the Department of History at the University of Minnesota. His studies focuses on themes such as cognitive history, history and memory, comparative revolutions, drug violence in the Americas, and human rights. He has several publications, among them A Brief History of Memory, which follows more than 100 years of memory research, and Cognitive History, examines how cognitive studies in psychology and neuroscience can change the way historians write about the past. Today, his presentation, the name of his presentation is Trauma and Historical Dissociation, Multiple Forms of Memory Confront the Past. Please, let's welcome him.
I am, as the only historian presenting in this conference, and actually the only historian who consistently participated in the collaboration on memory and trauma, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the collaboration for tolerating my disciplinary perspective. But the truth is, I'm not a very disciplined historian, and I feel most welcome here at this crossroads of art and science. In recent years, I've stopped working in archives and started dealing with current human rights issues around drug violence and gang violence in Mexico and El Salvador. I have found trauma everywhere I look with this new area of research, and I hope to share some of what I'm learning with you all today. Reflecting on the past reveals an obvious connection between the concepts of history and memory. That relationship, however, has often been described as a conflict, or as what I would consider an unnecessary tension between the work of historians and the work of memory scholars. Sociologist Maurice Holbach considered history and memory distinct from one another. History was for specialists, he argued, and historians had little interest in the present. Historical studies identified change, while memories, or for him, collective memories, stressed continuity. Nor was history as complicated as collective memory for Holbach. In fact, he argued that history, he says, is, quote, unitary, and it can be said that there is only one history. Every fact is as interesting as any other and merits as much to be brought forth and recorded. Well, setting aside my disagreements with Holbach's view of history and even his notion of collective memory, in the remainder of the presentation, I want to consider how traumatic events complicate my own attempt to find meaning in the past and in the present, in history and in memory. Trauma narratives, or traumata, challenge the usual approach to thinking about memory as a recording operation of a previous experience. Psychogenic amnesia seems essential for survivors of trauma, but that process requires forgetting or omitting the details of an experience that we would usually look for when we search for more complete memories. At the same time, history to me seems incapable of adequately dealing with trauma. The aesthetic expectations of historical writing interfere with the transmission of feelings and emotions necessary for understanding the enduring legacy of traumatic episodes. In that sense, I think if historians want to engage in the present world, the field itself will need to undergo its own demystification about what it is we do. So I'm going to be dealing with trauma and memory and history in somewhat separate sections. In The Poetics of Transgenerational Trauma, Australian writer, poet, literary critic, and survivor of complex trauma disorder, diagnosis not recognized by the DSM-5. Mira Atkinson argues, quote, far from being a simple, upsetting memory of an event located in the past, trauma involves a complex psychic operation that challenges the notion of distinct psychic past and present. She reflects as well on the challenges of writing about trauma, what she calls impossibility of finding the truth in words, since, quote, trauma creates a condition of unreliability in its telling, end quote. The goal, she suggests, is to unlie, that is U-N-L-I-E, or to use writing to constitute the art of unlying. For that reason, she concludes that the dreamlike quality of traumatic memory would seem to lend itself to poetic and novelistic treatment and to memory fiction fusions. The memoir writing Atkinson refers to in Poetics is presented in Traumata. She tells of her own transgenerational trauma, noting, I come from a family of beautiful women, and all of the psychic trauma hidden by that simple sentence. Here, Atkinson confronts the intersection of patriarchy and trauma, inventing or offering at least a new word, traumarchy, as she calls it. I have to speak from the inside out, because patriarchy isn't out there. Our skin is not an impenetrable barrier against its effects. It infiltrates our beings and shapes our lives, first from the outside in, and then from the inside out. She argues that thinking of memory as being about the past is a mistake. Instead, she writes, traumatic memory is a kind of past in the present that informs the future. Those who are significantly affected by it are trapped in a temporal world they can neither comprehend nor control. Atkinson brings together her reading of neuroscience and traumatology to deal with her own life. Citing the neuroscience of traumatic memory, she states that the thalamus malfunctions in the overwhelmed brain, which results in traumatized people often remembering images, sights, sounds, and physical sensations without context, without a coherent story of the traumatic event. And yet psychology and neurology, the science of trauma, if you will, can only take her so far into understanding the reality of her own experience. It is the art of trauma, the anxiety of writing, the fear of not being believed when telling stories, the abstract collage of overlapping people, events, time, and place that help her make sense of trauma for herself and for her readers. The traumatic stories I plan to share with you are all of them used in an article I'm writing that responds to Attorney General Jeffrey Beauregard Sessions, the former Attorney General, in his asylum opinion, which is referred to as Matter of AB. In that opinion, Sessions argued that victims of domestic violence will likely not be eligible for asylum because they experienced private violence perpetrated at the hands of only a few specific individuals. His decision overturned decades of immigration court precedents and is being challenged. And what I want to do is also contribute to that challenge by arguing that so-called domestic violence in El Salvador is not at all private. It is public because of its visible enactment. It is conducted with impunity because of its privilege. It is tolerated by the state because the men who control politics and the police are unwilling to protect women who live their lives as second-class citizens. But I need to warn you that the stories I can share with you are not easy for me to talk about, or I doubt will be easy for you to hear. And I wonder how much I should really try to protect you as the audience from the emotions that I feel nearly every day when I read these. These are emotions that I have to keep to myself because I am a serious scholar, an objective country conditions expert, a rational rather than an emotional individual. But by omitting the graphic language of violence that induces trauma, I would argue that we are also protecting the perpetrators and bystanders of that violence. I don't know that there is another way to convey the pain of others, as Susan Sontag asked. Photographs, she concluded, can only go so far. And we all know, and we've been talking the last couple of days about the testimonials that describe violent actions, and we expect that readers will wince and shift and grow uncomfortable, but words don't break the skin or leave bruises or penetrate the body. So in short, traumatic narratives, traumata, once again, are themselves traumatic to read or to hear. But that's our work here. We cannot become immune or desensitized, but neither can we avoid the discomfort of saying out loud what happened, what is happening, and what we want to stop. So I'm going to start off a little bit slowly, and then I'm going to gauge your reaction to see how deep into this I'll go. The first story of trauma is one that deals with statistics. In this slide, what is important to me are the large number of females represented in the number of people who have been disappeared. Women represent just over 10% of the number of people who have been killed in El Salvador since 2010, but they represent over 30% of the number of people who have been disappeared. In fact, more women have been disappeared than have been killed. I have some ideas about how that might, or why that might be the case, but it might take a little too long to actually get into that. But to realize that the trauma that a family experiences, of course, when someone is disappeared, is something that continues, that never ends. And the families of women are suffering that in greater numbers than we would expect. According to a United Nations Population Fund report, preteen and teen pregnancy in El Salvador should be considered a form of violence. The report documents that every year, more than 1,400 girls ages 10 to 14 become pregnant and enter prenatal programs through the national healthcare system. And once pregnant, they are not allowed to terminate that pregnancy. Each of these underage girls, each of these underage pregnancies is prima facie evidence of rape. And each fetus provides DNA evidence against the rapist. But no one has been charged in these crimes, despite a law that says anyone who has either vaginal or anal sexual contact with a person younger than 15 years old will be punished with imprisonment for a period between 14 and 20 years. The next few are cases, and they are almost literally or almost cut and pasted from reports that I've written. This is a quotation. Her father forced her to kneel on sharp objects for as long as an hour. In one episode, he punched his daughter in the face with a closed fist, threw her against the wall, pulled her hair, and sat on her chest as he continued to slap. His abusive behavior extended to sadistic sexual assault. He began molesting her when she was 7, and as she grew older, he would force her and her younger brother to remove their shirts, pour lime juice and salt on their backs, and then demand they lick each other clean. He forced his daughter to listen to him describe graphic sexual acts, and when he beat her with a belt, he would yell sexually explicit insults at her. He used the belt as a whip, sometimes leaving welts, bruises, and inflicting pain to the point she could not sit. She observed him beating his first and second wives and all of his children, including an infant sibling, a 2-year-old half-sister, a 4-year-old stepbrother, and her younger brother. She had to bear the knowledge that she was not her father's only victim of abuse, and that no one could escape his violence. Case 46. The applicant stated that a local MS-13 clique had ordered her to pay a $100 fee for protection, extortion. She lived alone with 2 children, a 12-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy she had conceived after being raped by a utility man working at the house where she had been a maid. There was no way for her to pay the extortion. She reported in her Form I-589 that when she came home from the market one day, she walked into her house and saw a man with his pants around his ankles raping her daughter. Unlike most other crime victims, the applicant reported this incident to the police. The young man actually admitted he had committed the rape, but told the judge in the case that his family would pay $5,000 for the raped girl to seek psychological therapy. And the judge recommended that the mother accept the offer and drop her complaint. When she refused, other gang members issued death threats against the mother and her 2 children. They are seeking asylum. Case 70. The applicant states that she has scars from the beatings she endured. She recounts how her husband, a former police officer, once pulled her naked out of the shower by her hair, dragged her to the front yard, and left her there for neighbors to see how he controlled her. He repeatedly threatened to kill her if she reported his abuse to his former colleagues in the police department, although the public nature of that abuse should have drawn police investigators independently to their home. She fled because she believed her life was at risk. And now that she is receiving therapy in the United States for the years of abuse she suffered, she has found the words to describe a particularly violent episode when her husband returned to their home drunk and used a knife to cut her vulva. She believes he would have killed her that night had she not managed to escape to a locked room. And the last one. Case 133. I have trouble getting through this one. According to the police report and the autopsy submitted as part of an asylum application, a 16-year-old girl was kidnapped by a group of 5 gang members. A witness heard her calling for help and then reported what had happened. The girl was tied to a tree as the young men took turns hitting her, not too hard at first, but later more and more severely. When she grew tired, they forced her to the ground and took turns raping her. Then they tied an orange nylon rope tightly around her neck and hung her from a mango tree. They left her to suffocate as her neck broke from the weight. The autopsy recorded the weight of each organ, a toxicology analysis that concluded she had not been using drugs or alcohol, and then stated that the girl's body was facing north as it hung in the tree, that she was wearing a plaid skirt with matching shoulder straps, a V-neck sweater, a sky blue blazer, white underwear, and transparent plastic sandals. Her underwear had blood stains and there was bodily fluid around her vagina and anus. The father of his victim and his only remaining daughter fled El Salvador because the gang had threatened to do to this other girl what they had done to the first. These documents were provided to the expert by the father, who is seeking asylum for himself and for his surviving daughter. So how does trauma complicate memory? Psychogenic amnesia or dissociative amnesia is a memory disorder characterized by sudden retrograde episodic memory loss, said to occur for a period of time ranging from hours to years. In fact, traumatic memories challenge many of the assumptions about memory writ large. That memory is or often will be somehow more accurate or authentic than history. That memory, particularly consolidated memories, are fixed, stable, less likely to change, at least if we don't consider the process of reconsolidation. And of course, we know that traumatic experiences create fragmented memories. that cortisol, the stress hormone, combines with the neurotransmitter epinephrine to disrupt memory consolidation. Structural elements of the memory are missing due to dissociation, irregular encoding, and data-driven focus that interferes with emotional tagging. Memory works best in the first-person singular, since neurological research suggests that memory should primarily focus on the process of memory formation for an individual, since a brain is always involved. And yet I find that consideration of traumatic memories has contributed to the proliferation of memory terms themselves, adjectives, adverbs, metaphors used to describe memory. 333 by my count, and yet we have one term for history. In fact, just over 10 years ago, the renowned psychologist Endel Tulving asked in an essay, "Are there 256 different kinds of memory?" He answers, yes, but actually I've found 77 more, and my list reaches 333. What we're learning in other research is that the brain is memory. It is not where memories exist or are stored. The organ is the system itself of memory. What in the brain is not memory, it would be the question. What in the brain is not related to memory? I think that's out of order. Moving on then to history. How am I for time? Okay. A contemporary history of the present moment in El Salvador would not allow me to write in the way that I want about the traumatic stories I shared with you. The traumatic stories I read nearly every day. I have 170, and I've shared with you 4. I can't write history because I no longer feel objective or dispassionate, and I have trouble pretending that these stories haven't touched me. In fact, there is one immigration judge out in Bloomington who has concluded that I am not a country conditions expert on gang violence. I am instead, he has decided, an advocate for asylum refugees. In my research on disappeared persons, the dozens of interviews I've done with gang experts and victims of violence in El Salvador is of only limited use to him. History excels at describing atrocities, violence, genocide, war, and providing a causality, or at least an explanation of the past, that people did not have when those events took place. History works best as a narrative of other people's stories. But history seems incapable of conveying the trauma that I'm interested in because it describes behavior. It does not know how to describe feelings, doubts, or uncertainties. While historians no longer make truth claims about their work, they rarely express the chaos of violence, the simultaneous acts of perpetrator and victim, what one person feels while inflicting pain and what the other person feels while being the object of that pain. History avoids emotions, or at least emotional retelling, because emotion requires doubts and uncertainties, unanswered questions. And historians generally reject those questions about the past, largely because they know what has already happened from consequence. They are, like Greg Denning described, meteorologists predicting yesterday's weather. Historians largely fail to return a sense of the present to the past. The present, as we know from our own lives, is characterized by uncertainty, by these fragments, and by haze and fog about what is happening beyond our own purview here in this room. If memory studies is too diffuse, too eager to embrace the newest term for describing memory as if it were something else than the consolidation and reconsolidation of synaptic connections in the brain, then history is by far too narrow. One of the problems, I think, of our present time is that the past appears irrelevant in a world where too many people seek constantly current knowledge and experience. In fact, this search is more likely to lead to frustration and disorientation, since only something outside of time could be constantly current and always new. It is simply impossible for humans to live entirely in the present, even with an eye on the future. For the evolution of our brains to think in terms of time began millions of years ago, and it seems unlikely we will ever return to a state of unconscious temporal existence. Luckily, we would not be capable of realizing what we have lost if it were to happen. By way of conclusion, I just want to highlight that what I'm arguing here today is that memory, for me, requires a brain. It is about the present and the future, but not about the past. The brain is, in fact, memory itself. Collective memory, as Hubert described it, is much more like history than memory. It is a discursive process, not a neurological process. It emphasizes continuity through an intentional impulse to rewrite the past. It, too, is about the present and not about the past. When we consider trauma, we should privilege, though, neither memory or history. Instead, we might embrace forgetting. Friedrich Nietzsche argued that an animal's inability to ruminate on the past allowed it to, quote, disappear entirely into the present, or to live without history. Humans, by contrast, carried what he called the great and ever greater burden of the past that left little room for happiness. The only path to happiness, he said, is, quote, the ability to forget, or, expressed in a more scholarly fashion, the capacity to feel ahistorically over the entire course of one's duration. I have listened to judges and Homeland Security attorneys interrogate asylum applicants about small inconsistencies, apparent contradictions, and gaps in memory. And I've listened to men and women re-experience that trauma as they recount horrific acts committed against them or a loved one, using only short phrases so that the translator can keep up with the story. As these people sit and wait for a nod to continue, their pain rises to the surface in a visible way as they anticipate what to say next, how to be believable, and how to put into words the acts of violence stored in their bodies and memories that they have tried so hard to forget simply in order to survive. Thanks.